and it's their intrinsic
And they found, this food basically robbed.
sound, feasible, sound like the Greeks. So now when we go back, we find Hellenistic Judaism. And Hellenistic Judaism completely contradicts the letters of Orestes. Because in the letters of Orestes, the whole theme of Greece was basically to free the Jews, get this whole translation done. Because they basically said, hey, we all worship the same God, we just call them different names and everything is cool. But Hellenism is basically contradicting all that. Because Hellenism is basically trying to force these Jews to worship Greek gods and follow Greek customs. Now understand, the Greeks actually ruled Israel during this time. So how could Hellenism and Judaism coexist? They could have just tore down all the temples and forced the people to worship Greek gods. And that's basically what happened, except that there was no Judaism. Judaism was created by the Greeks, but they have to put it together to make it seem like they both was there at the same time, when you really think about it, it doesn't make any sense for them to be there at the same time. So listen, it says, Hellenistic Judaism was a form of Judaism in the ancient world that combined Jewish religious traditions with elements of Greek culture until the fall of the Roman Empire and the Muslim conquest. Now listen, that is very important right there. It says until the fall of the Roman Empire. Why till the fall of the Roman Empire and not the Greek Empire? Understand that the Romans came along and they obviously continued with this whole Hellenistic theme. Why? That is the key point. And a lot of people is not putting that together, that when the Romans conquered the Greeks, you got the whole Greco-Roman era. That's why they put them together, because they obviously figured something out. So what happened is you have Hellenism. So what is Hellenism? What is this whole Hellenistic rule? You have the Greeks trying to force a culture onto a people. So if you're trying to force a culture and a religion onto a people, and you are the ruling elite, why would you allow those people to practice their own religion when you're trying to get them to practice yours? So it don't make sense for Hellenism to allow Judaism to exist when the Greeks are the rulers, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So it doesn't make sense that this whole Judaism was going on, because Hellenism was a religion. They had a Hellenistic religion, and it was the worship of Greek gods and Serapis. So let's go here and check this out. It says Hellenistic religion. Hellenistic religion is any of the various systems of beliefs and practices of the people who lived under the influence of the ancient Greek culture during the Hellenistic period and the Roman Empire. So understand, it's talking about, this is Rome and Greece allowing this to go on. Now, when I finish reading this, and as I'm reading it, to people who are in the know, if you study a lot, I think a light bulb will go off in a lot of your heads. For those of you who understand the astrology and the mathematics that's in the Bible, this is going to make a lot more sense to you. So it gives a date here, 300 BCE to 300 CE. There was much continuity in Hellenistic religion. The Greek gods continued to be worshipped, and the same rites were practiced as before. So if they practicing the same things, they practicing worshiping the Greek gods. So why would they allow Judaism to continue? It didn't exist yet, obviously. Change came from the addition of the new religions from other countries, including the Egyptian deities, Isis and Serapis. And we know Serapis was basically created by Ptolemy. And the Syrian god of Atargatis and Hadad, which provided a new outlet for people seeking fulfillment in both the present life and the afterlife. The worship of Hellenistic rulers was also a feature of this period, most notably in Egypt, where the Ptolemies adopted their early pharaonic practice and established themselves as god kings. Understand that, god kings. They wanted to be god kings. They wanted to be worshipped. They didn't like the fact that these black people was worshiping these black gods and that white people was worshiping these black gods. So they wanted to be god kings. This is where whole Serapis thing come from. When you look at Serapis, he looks like Jesus. He looks like Zeus. This is where it starts out at. Elsewhere, rulers might receive divine status without a full status of a god. Magic was practiced widely, and this too was a continuation from earlier times. Throughout the Hellenistic world, people would consult oracles and use charms and figurines to deter misfortune or to cast spells. Also developed in this era was the complex system of astrology, which sought to determine a person's character and fortune in the moments of the sun, moon, and planets. I'm going to stop right there. This is important to understand because a lot of people don't realize that they knew about this stuff. A lot of people think way back then, even though they see the pyramids and they see what the Egyptians did, they think these people was just super primitive and they didn't know nothing. They knew about all this stuff, and you can see it in the Bible for those of you who are in the know. You know what's there. You know what Genesis is talking about. You know what Adam and Eve is really about, and I'm going to get into that. So it's showing you that these people knew about this. They understood what was going on, and it was trying to get these people in Israel to worship these gods, but obviously they were not. So what did they do? They created the Old Testament and forced this whole religion on these people. Since you know about Serapis, since you know about Zeus and everybody like that, we're going to have to get some of these black leaders who basically are in Israel. We're going to have to bring them to our side and get them to teach this whole thing to the other people to get them to learn this whole Old Testament. That's how it started. Whether you want to accept it or not, and I'm going to continue on and get into more proof, more sources and everything, but that's what happened because they wouldn't accept Serapis. They wouldn't accept them. They wouldn't accept Zeus. They wouldn't accept none of this stuff, which is why you find Greek mythology in the Old Testament, as I was showing you before. We're going to switch it up, and we're going to create this whole religion, and we still going to get y'all to worship it. We're going to force it on y'all. We just ain't going to tell y'all what it is. Now, another people who I don't want to forget is the Assyrians and the Babylonians. We know, just like the Ionians, just like the Canaanites, that the Assyrians and the Babylonians was coming into Egypt, coming into Israel, and trading with the Egyptians. We know this because we have the artifacts to prove it. When you look at all these artifacts and you start going through them, you can see the Egyptian influence. You can see we have artifacts from these people in abundance. Look at this Eye of Horus. This is made by an Assyrian, but we know it's Egyptian. So it proves that they were coming in there and they were learning from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians was influencing them in many ways. Look at the writing, look at the carvings in the stone. So they was picking up a lot. Now, we know that the Assyrians and the Babylonians was in Israel because we found artifacts that was attributed to the Assyrians and the Babylonians in Israel. The only artifacts we don't find is artifacts of the Hebrews. We have all of these artifacts that we can point towards the Egyptians, towards the Babylonians, towards the Assyrians, but nothing for the Hebrews. But since they know that the Assyrians and the Babylonians was in Israel, they got to try to attach themselves to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So that's why we found them in the Bible, and it's talking about the Assyrians taking the Hebrews and deporting them to Mesopotamia or deporting them to Babylon. But let's get real. What is really the Assyrians and the Babylonians? You're basically talking about North Mesopotamia, South Mesopotamia. We're talking about the same people. We're talking about the Assyrians and the Babylonians in the same area, which is basically modern day Iraq. Now, the Jews always try to attach themselves to a people, or the Hebrews in the Bible is always attaching themselves to a people that we know existed, that we have proof of their existence. They do this to try to give validity to themselves, but we can never find them. So they're always attaching themselves from people, from person to person to person, but somehow never leaving any trace. They try to do this to give validity to their story, but it's all bullshit. So now we know eventually the Greeks got the people in Israel to accept this doctrine. They got them to accept this whole Judaism. But as the religion began to spread into places like Syria and other places, what happened? The whole war broke out between them and the Romans. And we know the Romans won and conquered the Greeks. This began this whole Greco-Roman era. Now, we don't know if the Romans knew what was taking place with this whole Hellenization going on in Israel. We don't know if they knew about the doctrine straight away, but at some point they figured it out because they let Hellenization continue. We know it continued under the Romans. Now, why would they do that? So a lot of people would say that, well, Hellenization and the whole Judaism was separate, but we know it cannot possibly be separate, because if you're trying to push a religion onto a people, you're not going to let them have a religion of their own, as I said before. But the Romans allowed this whole thing to continue. Now, the one thing the Romans did, because they were smart, was like, well, you can't just have these people in Israel believing in this doctrine. We got to get everybody else. So they got to get their own people. You got to get the Greeks to start becoming Jews and believing in this whole Jewish doctrine. So Judaism spread into Greece, of course. Now we know today the oldest Jewish synagogue in the world is in Greece. It's in Delos, Greece, and it dates back to 150 to about 120 BCE. So we know that was around the time when the Romans was conquering the Greeks. Now, the whole thing you got to remember is this. The Old Testament they was using back then is not the same as the one we have today. It was completely different. Now, this is the reason why when they show you the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't give you a complete version. They give you a bunch of fragments and a bunch of little shards and papers saying that this is all we have. They found over 800 manuscripts in those caves, and they can't give you a complete copy of the Old Testament because it's different from the one you have today. Now, we know about the Jewish war that Josephus writes about. The reason why that war started is because the Jews in Israel believed that their doctrine was being fulfilled, that their prophecy was coming true, and they had a warrior that was going to lead them to victory against the Romans, or against their oppressors, who happened to be the Romans. So they attacked the Romans, and we know what happened. Titus Flavius destroyed the Jewish temple, and he left with a bunch of their writings, and he left with a bunch of basically war trophies, and that's why the Arch of Titus is in Rome today, depicting what happened back then. So we're talking around between 66 and 70 AD. This is when they believe the Dead Sea Scrolls was hidden, right around this time. Now, I went through this in my last video, but understand, once the Jews lost this battle with the Romans, you got to think about it. If they really believed that they was fulfilling some kind of prophecy, if they believed that they had a Messiah or they had a warrior that was going to lead them to victory against their oppressors, when that didn't happen, of course, a lot of the Jews would lose faith. A lot of the people would start doubting their doctrine. So this was the opportunity that the Romans used to basically go ahead and instill a new doctrine. Now, this is why a lot of scholars believe that Josephus was really just the writing name of Arius Piso, because the Piso family had actually put together a doctrine that they was waiting to, put into place. They already had something ready. They had a doctrine ready to go. So now this also gave the Romans the opportunity to make it so that they are looked upon more favorably. So we know that the Caesars wanted to be worshipped as gods. We know that the Greeks wanted to be looked upon more favorably as well, because they came up with the Old Testament and it was getting ready to come up with the New Testament. So they made it so they were both looked upon more favorably, which is why we find the Greeks and the Romans all in the New Testament. And I don't know how that's not suspect to so many people when you start doing this research. That is highly suspect to me. So now what do you tell these Hebrews after their whole prophecy was not fulfilled, they was defeated? You tell them it's their fault. You tell them they messed up, they broke God's covenant, or something to that effect. So when you go on and read Hebrews 8, 6 through 9, it says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established under better promises, upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Now, according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, save the Lord." So now all this stuff is going on between, we're talking 66 AD and about 160 AD, around the first and second century. You got this whole Jewish war happening. You got the New Testament coming into play, and everything is changing between the Jews and the Greeks and the Christians now and the Jews. Because the whole thing is, of course, a lot of these Jews did not accept this whole New Testament, which is why today we still have Judaism and Christianity. A lot of them wasn't buying into it. Now, the reason why a lot of them wasn't buying into it was because of what St. Jerome did when he created the Latin Vulgate. He changed a lot of the Septuagint. And he basically said he did so because he was trying to correct the Hebrew. Now, the Masoretes was like the biggest critics of the Greek Old Testament and New Testament. They believe it all should be in Hebrew, and nobody can really fathom why the New Testament was in Greek and Jesus was supposed to have spoken Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever. So it was suspect. So now you got to think about it in terms of, let's look at today. We got the Old Testament today, we got the New Testament. So what if somebody came out with another testament of the Bible today? Like a whole testament, and they wanted to add it on, something after our New Testament. Now, our New Testament has revelations when everything's supposed to end. So let's say this whole next testament, let's call it, comes along and, just adds this whole doctrine that says, but wait, such and such, and changes the whole Bible. This is basically what happened to the Jews. And so you can imagine back then when they got this Old Testament and they're reading it and they're into it, then they know that the Greeks are screwing them. They know that the Romans are screwing them. Then all of a sudden, this whole New Testament comes along that makes the Romans and Greeks be looked upon favorably. So now understand, all of this history is building up to something. It's all building up to something. So stick with me, bear with me. I'm going to get into all this Hebrew mess a little bit later on, but you got to understand this Old Testament part. You got to know this history in order for me to really crush this doctrine. I got to crush this Old Testament first and show you the truth behind it, because it has been changed so much. And it's one of the things that I'm going to get into in this video about how much it was changed and why it was changed, because there's a lot you have to explain about what happened in Israel. We know it obviously was full of black people. Today it's not. How did that happen? We got to understand and realize the change that occurred. We got to look at these people differently and stop looking at the Bible as its actual history and look at actual history. The Bible is not. When you go look at the Bible, you're not looking at actual history. So I got to give you this history so you can know the truth. So bear with me. I know it's long, and if you stuck with me this long in this video, you are a true scholar or a true student, and you're trying to really understand real history. I get some people that complain about the length of videos, and I look at them like, if you can't watch, a two hour video or a 3 hour video, even a 6 hour video, I don't see you reading books. I don't see people who can't sit there and watch a video and take notes actually reading the whole book. So I look at these people as, comment thugs or jokes. Real scholars read. Real scholars, what we would love, I would love to be able to just sit down and just watch a video and get a history. So understand this history. I'm giving you books. I'm giving you so many books through the video. You can see that they pop up in the corner down there. It shows you what books to go reference. I'm giving you a lot of references because I really want you to get this history so I can break people out of this whole Bible crap. It's a shame that so many people is caught up in this mess. And now, for anybody who's really understanding what I'm saying in this video so far, when you look at it and you start learning the history, you see how stupid it really is that, once you do some research, you can figure out what basically happened. So now we know that the whole Hellenization continued up until 300 AD. So we're talking 300 AD. This is under Roman rule. So again, why would the Romans continue Hellenization? You have Judaism, and now you have Christianity, going into full swing, basically. So why would you continue to push this Hellenization and this worship of Serapis? So now you got to understand that Hellenization was the spreading of Judaism and Christianity and not Serapis. They took Serapis and changed Serapis into Jesus Christ. You got Serapis, but they basically took Osiris and the Egyptian god Apis and put them together and gave us Serapis and put a white face on them to get these black people in Egypt to worship a white god, to get everybody to worship a white god. This is what they did. And they changed them into Jesus Christ. You got Jesus Christ. Jesus is basically attributes of Zeus and of the Druidic or the Druid carpenter god Jesus. Now, the Greeks was the first to even write about the Druids, and we first heard about the Druids from the Greeks. So now this carpenter guy, Jesus is supposed to be the son of a carpenter. Yeah, that's where his name came from. It came from this carpenter god, Jesus. So now you get Christos or Christ, which they used to call Serapis, Serapis Christos. But the first mention of a Christos is from what? It's from Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. He talks about Christos in the Odyssey on page 4 and page 252, and in the Iliad on page 23 and 186. He talks about it being oil that you put on your body when you get out of the bathtub. This is the first mention of a Christ or Christos. So now the Greeks, they also write themselves into the New Testament as being looked upon favorably. They're talking to Christ and dealing with Christ. And Christ says, you know, no matter if you're Greek or Jew, it doesn't matter. As long as you believe in me, you know, you can be saved. So when you read 1 Corinthians 1:23 to 23, it says, for the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. So the whole thing is, how are you going to get these Greeks wisdom through the Bible? And that's one of the things the Bible is about, because it teaches a lot about mathematics, especially astrology, but also physics. So when you go read Genesis 5:1, it's talking about the atom. Atom is basically the atom, not an actual man. Now, the thing is, when you read Genesis 5:1 through 2, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam. In the day they were created. Their name Adam. He called their name Adam. Meaning, how do you call Adam and Eve Adam? Now understand, when you read Genesis 5, it doesn't even explain what happens to Eve. It doesn't even mention Eve at all. They're clearly trying to point to something here. They're talking about the atom. So now I went through this in my previous video, and I had a lot of people jump on in the comment section and say, oh, you're an idiot. And they didn't know about atoms, you know, so long ago. And, you know, you stupid. I had people talk about that. And the whole thing is, the first mention of atoms is by Leucippus, who was from Miletus. He's a Greek. He was from Ionia. He was an Ionian. This is the first mention of atoms. Aristotle is on record as going against them, saying that, you know, they couldn't fathom something so small being so powerful. So it's on record. They knew about atoms a long time ago, way before this Bible ever came about. They knew about atoms basically before the Greeks conquered the Egyptians. They already knew about it. When you trace back and do the etymology on the word atom, it goes back to Greek, atomos. So they already knew about the atom a long time ago, which is why when you go and read Revelations, when it's talking about 666, it's talking about the atom. It's talking about man. 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons creates carbon, which creates man. They knew about this already. I went into all this in that video. If you have not seen that video, that's Game the Bible and Christianity Finally Explained, watch it. I know it's long, but check the video out. It has a lot of information. So now we can start bringing this whole thing to a close and start really destroying this whole Hebrew Israelite doctrine and shedding some light on it. Now understand this. From 92 BCE all the way until 629 AD, the Persians returned and were at war with the Romans. So we're talking about when the New Testament was being written and created, Rome was at war with the Persians. They was already at war with them for hundreds of years. This is a long war that lasted. Now, also, because of the New Testament, you had a bunch of Jews leaving Roman-controlled countries. They was leaving Israel. They was leaving Syria. They was going out into the Middle East and going out into Africa and teaching Judaism. The Christians was doing the same thing as well. We also know the Jews was going into Arabia and trying to spread Judaism, because the Persian king Farouk was persecuting Jews in 460 AD. We know that the Jews was going into Yemen and persecuting the Christians, and they eventually took over Yemen, and they was persecuting Christians also in Ethiopia. Now in around 610 is when Islam really came onto the scene and started to spread. The Muslims eventually took over in Yemen, and they was persecuting Jews all the way up until the 20th century. We know Steven Spielberg did a whole documentary on this, and I showed a little bit of it in my video about Islam. So understand that once the whole Arab conquest started, you had the Arabs going into all of these Christian and Judaism controlled places, all these Jews and Christians who was all spread throughout the Middle East and some into parts of Africa. Once Islam began to spread, the Arabs took over. So now understand, this is one of the parts I was talking about in my last video. You got to realize that the war between the Persians and the Romans ended in a status quo antebellum, which basically means a truce. So the whole thing is, you got to look at it and say, well, how is it that the Arabs was able to use the Old Testament in their Islamic doctrine? And why would the Romans allow that? Why would the Jews allow it? So now understand that the Jews had hundreds of years to spread Judaism throughout the Arab world, throughout the Arab kingdom, throughout the Levant region, into the Middle East. As I said before, we know they went into Yemen. We know that the Jews were all over the Middle East. The Christians as well. They spread into Yemen, they spread into Syria, they spread into parts of Africa, into the Middle East, and they were both spreading this doctrine. Because one, you had basically a whole sect of Jews who was against Christianity way back then. They was persecuting the Christians way back then. A lot of the stories that you read about persecuted Christians was coming from the Jews, coming from the Jews themselves. And a lot of people got confused and thought it was the Christians persecuting Christians when it was Jews persecuting them. People was blaming it on Rome, saying, well, that came later on with the Crusades. I'm gonna get into that, when the Christians was persecuting Christians. But before that, you had the Jews persecuting Christians. So understand, there was a pre-Islamic Arab conquest. A lot of people, they go and look at the Arab conquest and they immediately associate it with Islam. But this was before Islam really came onto the scenes. We're talking about 5th century, before Muhammad was even supposed to be born. It was the Arab conquest, and it was going in and it was taking over a lot of areas that the Jews was ruling. We know they took over Yemen and they persecuted the Jews there. But when Islam came onto the scene and a lot of those Arabs started to adopt Islam, it became a whole Islamic conquest, and they conquered a lot of areas. They came into Israel, they came into Egypt, they came into the whole Levant region, and they took over so many territories controlled by the Jews and the Christians. So understand, this is where the change occurred. This is how Egypt became full of Arabs. This is how the so-called black Hebrews got from out of Israel, and it became full of Arabs, full of Greeks, because of the Islamic slave trade, which began in 650 AD. So understand, when you read Deuteronomy 28:68, and it's talking about going back to Egypt in ships, and they want you to think, these Hebrews want you to think that it's talking about America. How come it's not talking about the Muslims? The first slavery that these people that was inside of Israel occurred happened under Islam. It didn't happen in America. So why isn't Deuteronomy 28:68 talking about the Arabs, talking about the Muslims, saying that they will go into slavery under Islam? Why isn't it saying anything about that? Because the first slavery that these people endured happened under Allah, happened in Islam. And we all know this. So that's one of the things that I always point out to these so-called Hebrew Israelites, and saying, well, where's the prophecy about the Muslims? Why is it talking about slavery that's going to occur thousands of years later, when the first major slavery that they run into is under the Arabs? And they was enslaved under the Arabs for longer, twice the time that they would be enslaved under the people in America, under the Americans, under the white people there. So it's suspect as hell, like I said, but I'm going to get into Deuteronomy 28:68, because like I said, they didn't always say that. They changed that. And I'm going to show you.